Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. Before we introduce the speaker, I want to make a few brief announcements. We know many of you are listening in from far away and can't attend local events or programs. That's why we provide this free webinar series. We host multiple webinars per month, so please visit our website to view the current schedule for 2017. Simply visit our website at www.johnson-center.org and click on the webinar links on the right-hand side. New webinars and events are often added, so if you are not on our email list, I encourage you to visit our website and click on the Join Our Email List link that appears on the home page. To get instant news and events from the Johnson Center, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter as we announce grant and scholarship opportunities, research opportunities, and last-minute events and presentations there. You can find links for these on our website at www.johnson-center.org. Be sure to follow our colleagues at the Austin Research Institute as they host their own webinar initiative and they share some great resources on their website and social media pages. Before we begin the presentation, please note that questions may be typed into your control panel throughout the presentation, and time permitting, they will be addressed during the presentation. Also, for those who have requested copies of the presentation, we don't send out the presentation slides. However, we do post recordings of all our free webinars on the Johnson Center YouTube channel. Please search for us on YouTube and subscribe to get full access to all of our recorded webinars. If you would like a certificate of attendance after today's webinar, look for a follow-up email in your mailbox 1 hour after the webinar concludes. It will contain instructions on how to download your certificate. Now please welcome today's presenter, Amanda Tami. Amanda holds a master's degree in counseling psychology and a completed recertification program in applied behavior analysis. In addition to being board-certified behavior analysis, Amanda is a licensed professional counselor. She has experience working with both children and adults on the autism spectrum and other pervasive developmental disorders as both an ABA provider and a counselor. Since 2013, Amanda has shared her experience and knowledge within the Johnson Center Behavioral Service programs, giving her the opportunity to pursue her passion for helping children and their families. She provides ABA supervision, school support, and counseling services to people with developmental issues and their family members, and is a valued member to the Johnson Center family. Now please welcome our presenter, Amanda Tami.
Thank you, and thanks all for being here today. We're going to be talking about using self-management strategies to increase independence. A lot of the examples that I'm going to give today are from the classroom, but please keep in mind that, and that's just because that's where I have used them a lot, that's where much of my experience is, but please know that these are strategies and these are interventions that you can use anywhere, any setting with any student or child who it's the appropriate intervention for. It's certainly not limited to the classroom or to school settings. Now, in our traditional models of support, teachers, therapists, paraprofessionals, anyone who is working with a child with autism or another disorder are told to make sure that the student reaches this goal or does this behavior. So the teaching staff often ends up acting as planners for the students and then are prompting the student to engage in those activities or participate in social interactions and use the appropriate behaviors. This model has some advantages. The work gets done, the student follows classroom routines and instructions, the teacher is able to focus on the lesson and the rest of the class, and ideally, there is a designated support person in place for behavior management. On the other hand, it can also create unnecessary dependence on other people. It can interfere with peer interactions, it can interfere with teacher involvement with the student. So while this model does ensure that the child finishes this assignment or is engaged in the lesson or interacts and behaves as expected, it doesn't give students an opportunity to learn needed skills to succeed independently. Plus, some students struggle with these same issues, but they don't qualify for one-on-one support in their IEPs or even small group support. So how do we help these kids succeed while not limiting the teacher's attention to the rest of the class? If our solution each time is to put in more people, number one, that's probably not going to happen because schools just don't have the funding to keep adding people to provide more one-on-one support or even more small group support. So we're probably not going to get support in that form, but we also get more prompting, the paraprofessional or the teacher does the work, and the student isn't learning the skill. And when I say they do the work, I mean they're doing the planning, the executive functioning, the all the things that are required so in advance so that the student can complete an assignment or can interact or say hello to other students when they greet them. And as professionals, this is our fault. If we're giving multiple prompts, the student is developing prompt dependence. They're not developing the skill. So instead, we need to teach the student to use different systems. Keyword here being teach. This is a point I'm going to come back to again and again during this presentation. These self-management strategies are things that need to be taught. They are not things that things that we can just hand to the student and say, here, use this, and expect them to know how to use it. So today we're going to talk about self-management strategies to increase independence. So if we're going to introduce one of these interventions, we first need to prioritize instructional goals. That means what is most important, what does the student need to learn to be able to learn what we want them to. If our goal is for the student to be able to follow class routines and complete their work, we may first need to teach them a replacement behavior to their challenging behaviors. If they have some challenging behaviors that prevent them from being able to reach this goal, we need to address those first before we can start teaching them to follow classroom routines and complete work. So prioritizing means what are those prerequisite skills or what are those behaviors that are getting in the way of them being able to do this behavior that we ultimately want. And this is something that we should be considering for any behavior, no matter what or where we're teaching, but it's especially important when we're trying to transfer the responsibility of monitoring behavior to the student, which is the next consideration we need to take in this sort of intervention. As we're trying to increase independence, we are shifting behavior management responsibility from the teacher or from the provider to the student. So the student is now responsible for monitoring and changing their own behavior using these types of interventions. So it needs to be something that they are capable of doing and have mastered and are able to have all those prerequisite skills mastered for in order for them to be successful with self-management. And this is a pivotal behavior. A pivotal behavior is one that, once learned, it leads to improvement in a range of other behaviors, including those not specifically targeted. So if we can teach a student to manage their own behavior of one type of behavior, they now have the skill to manage their behavior and can apply that to other behaviors as well. And to do that, we are teaching the student first to be able to recognize correct and incorrect responses, or when they're doing a behavior and when they're not doing behavior, evaluating and monitoring that behavior, and reinforcing their own behavior. So in this webinar, you're going to be able to identify at least 3 situations in which teaching a student self-management strategies could increase independence. We're going to describe the steps to teach students to use self-management strategies, and at the end you'll be able to identify at least 2 ways to monitor progress in the use of these strategies. So we're first going to cover different types of self-management systems, and I'll give several examples of each type. We're going to talk about when self-management is appropriate, and I'm going to go in detail into the steps to teach self-management, so that my hope is that by the end of this webinar you will know in pretty high detail how exactly to develop and implement an intervention like this. So let's start with some types of self-management systems. There are several types of self-management or self-directed learning strategies that might be right for your student, and we're going to talk more about each of these as we get into some examples. The first is called antecedent cue regulation, and this is the use of any visual or even auditory prompt to help a student perform a target behavior. You probably already used some of these with your students. They include any sort of visual schedule, behavior expectation reminders, visual steps, all those visual cues that we use so often. Self-monitoring builds on antecedent cues, but requires the student to observe and record whether they have performed the behavior. Self-instruction is when a student provides instruction to him or herself on the steps to solve a problem. Self-evaluation involves a student monitoring and recording their behavior, similar to self-monitoring, but in this case, they're then comparing their behavior to predetermined criteria to say, yes, I've met this goal, or no, I haven't met this goal. And using self-reinforcement, the student accesses his or her own reinforcement after completing a goal. So please don't get caught up in all of this terminology and know that, or feel like you have to use self-monitoring in this case or self-instruction in another case. I'm just telling you the terminology, so that as I'm dividing it up into providing some examples, it's not necessary for you to be able to use these techniques. Really what you'll be looking for is what's right for your individual student. So let's talk more about each of these and look at some examples, starting with antecedent cue regulation. Remember, this is any visual or auditory prompt to help a student perform a target behavior. And I also want to remind everyone the purpose of each of these examples in this presentation is increasing independence. So there's lots of reasons to use visual schedules or other things. Specifically in this presentation, we are looking at them for the purpose of increasing independence. So taking out the need for an extra person to make sure something happens or a behavior happens. So in this example, it is a visual showing behavioral expectations. This might be on the student's desk or in the classroom, and it would just serve as a reminder or something that a paraprofessional could point to avoid needing to verbally prompt the student. These kinds of prompts are rarely used in isolation, meaning we don't just give it to the student and they can use it. Their behavior changes. Other interventions like modeling and reinforcement are usually needed to help the student know how to use it and to be able to use it correctly and apply it when they need to. And simply having this sort of reminder on the desk or in the classroom, somewhere where the student can see it, can increase independence. It might improve the behavior just by having it there. Just it being there can be enough to improve behavior. But it's often necessary that we teach the student what to do with it. This example is a social story with some pictures. Again, it's something the student can have and refer back to as needed. And this one shows the steps to complete the task of toileting. It gives the student the tool that he might need to do the task without the assistance of another person. And for things like toileting and other hygiene behaviors, these independent strategies are so important to be able to give the student the privacy and the dignity that we all expect and we all deserve with these types of behaviors. Especially as our students and children are growing closer to adulthood, if they have the capability to use the toilet, then teaching them to do so independently might be a really great behavior to teach. Now, notice that this is not something I created myself. I have the source at the bottom of the slide. And several of these are not things that I created myself. And I want you to realize that it's often possible to find tools, visuals, things that you can use that have already been created by someone else and modify them to your needs. You don't always have to start from scratch. Creating a visual schedule or a visual prompt like this, it can be a lot of work and can be kind of intimidating. It doesn't have to be. You can find something that already exists or model one after something that you have found online, and it can save you some time and some energy, and there's a lot of really great resources out there. So don't get overwhelmed with the need to start something from scratch or how am I going to create something like that. You may be able to find something that already is out there. Here's another example showing the steps to complete a task of making a sandwich. Again, one of those living skills that is important, especially as our kids get closer to adulthood. And this is just a very simple visual schedule. It says first you write, then you color, then you cut, then you glue. You do the task in this order. It can be really great to have pictures like these that are cut out and laminated and on Velcro, so that you can reorder them for different tasks without having to create a brand new visual schedule each time. You just reverse it to say first cut, then glue, then write, then color. You can also use auditory cues instead of visual cues. So a student might have a recording and press play on his iPod or CD player or a cassette player if you still have one of those, and the recording would talk through the steps. So I know of a boy who had an audio recording that he played when he needed to wash his hands. So he would use the bathroom, or just if he just needed to wash his hands, he would walk into the bathroom and press play on his iPod. And the recording told him the steps to wash his hands, and then it sang a song so that he knew when to stop washing his hands. And you might be thinking, okay, but that's still a verbal prompt, and don't we want to eliminate verbal prompts or decrease verbal prompts? And you're right, it is a verbal prompt. However, our goal here is increasing independence. So by having a recorded verbal prompt that the student can play by himself when needed, we're taking out the need for another person to be there in the bathroom with him to wash his hands. Again, giving him more privacy. And now, let's say Dad tells him, go wash your hands for dinner. He can go in and wash his hands, and Dad can finish making dinner. Dad doesn't have to stop and go in the bathroom with him. So we're able to record a prompt so that the student can be more independent. Now let's talk about self-monitoring, which is the next type of self-directed learning or self-management strategy. And in this case, a student observes and records whether or not they have done the target behavior. So you can see that in this example, we're taking the antecedent cue, or this visual, a step farther. In this case, the student has to check off when they finish each task. So this requires the student to be aware of their own behavior and evaluate whether or not they did that behavior and record it. Now, self-monitoring can get more complex as the student is ready. We'll look at some more complex examples in just a minute, but you want to set the timing of the student's evaluation of their own behavior as needed for the child's knowledge of their behavior over time. So as the student shows more competence in his awareness of his behavior, the intervals between recording might get longer, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Sometimes simply being aware of the behavior leads to a change in behavior. Other times reinforcement is critical. So you can decide for your individual student how effective self-monitoring is by itself, or if you need to find ways to incorporate reinforcement for that behavior. This is another example of a checklist. Once the child completes each task, they record it on the list. So they need to be able to recognize when they finish their homework to be able to check that one off. They need to be able to say correctly that I packed my backpack or not, and check it off when they have. This is another checklist. This one's a little bit for a little bit higher learner because it does have a prerequisite skill of being able to read. The student wouldn't be able to use this one unless they are able to read the words since there aren't pictures. And note that what is on here, listening to my teachers and what behaviors mean I'm listening to my teachers, are things that would be ongoing. It's not something that the student does once and now they can check it off. So the timing with something like this would really depend on your student's needs. They might record this information maybe once during a class period, or maybe it's every couple of minutes. Maybe there's a timer and every 1 minute they're recording whether or not they're doing those 3 behaviors. And the timing can change as the behavior improves. Now this is one that I like that you can use for different behaviors. The smiley face would represent whatever the desired behavior is, and the frowning face represents some unwanted behavior that we're trying to replace. And as the student self-monitors, he or she puts a check mark each time he or she does each behavior. Then at the bottom is an if-then statement describing the requirement to get reinforcement and what the chosen reinforcement is. So maybe it's something like the smiley face says, I followed the instruction as soon as the teacher gave it, and the frowning face is, I needed help, or I needed the teacher to repeat an instruction. For each instruction the teacher gives, the student records whether or not he followed the instruction the first time, or if he needed help or the teacher to repeat it. Note that the bottom part should always be decided and filled out before the student starts the task that requires self-monitoring. The criteria should always be in place prior to the start of tracking behavior so that there's no room for negotiation. That the student says, you know, I did this many, so can I get my reinforcement? If it's set in stone beforehand, there's no argument or no discussion about what, whether or not he should get it. This example is similar in that the student would put a check mark with the smiley face if they're doing the desired behavior, and with the not smiley face if they're not doing that behavior. I use something like this a lot for students who do their own time sampling. So every so many seconds or minutes, the student records whether or not they're doing the behavior at that time. For example, one student is working on keeping his hands to himself. So every 30 seconds an alarm beeps, and he records whether or not his hands are to himself. And if he's not, this also serves as a prompt for him to put his hands to himself. In self-instruction, a student provides instruction to him or herself, usually verbal or read, for the steps to perform a task or solve a problem. To use self-instruction, you teach the student to follow these steps. First, identify a problem. Second, state the solution. Third, evaluate the action. And fourth, deliver reinforcement. In this example, the problem is that the student is upset or on the verge of having a meltdown. So the student needs to be able to identify when they are upset and need to follow these steps. So identifying the problem is really a prerequisite to being able to go to the rest of the steps and do this independently. When the student recognizes they're upset, they do number 2, state the solution. In this case, possible solutions are calming strategies like counting to 20, taking deep breaths, being alone for a while, changing the channel in their mind. The student does one of those, and then step 3, evaluate it. Did it work? Am I calm? If not, go back and try another strategy. If so, she can reinforce herself by rejoining her friends or rejoining the group activity. Here's another example of self-instruction. In this case, the student is learning math word problems and figuring out whether or not he needs to add or subtract for his word problem. So the problem is, do I need to add or subtract to get the right answer? Excuse me. Once the student figures out that this is his problem, he can state the solution. Look for words like more, take away, or leave, and then complete the problem accordingly. To evaluate the action, he compares his answer to the math problem to the original numbers in the math problem. Is it more or less than the original numbers to match the words in the sentence? And if it matches, I get credit for the correct answer. If it doesn't match, we can revisit the solution and try again. So I had planned to leave some time here for you as the audience to send in some examples of antecedent cues or self-monitoring or self-instruction examples that you use that we haven't covered that we can share with everyone else. I know that there are a lot of examples out there, and it's great to share ideas with one another, but for the sake of time, I'm going to skip that and continue on to talk about self-evaluation tools. Self-evaluation requires the student to compare their performance of a target behavior with a set of predetermined criteria. So the student should know what their goal for that behavior is, what the criteria is, and then at the end of the day or class period or week or whatever the set time frame is, they evaluate how they have performed in relation to those criteria. You can see that in this example it says today in class. So this could be something that a student evaluates 5 times throughout a single class period. You could also use this throughout the day at the end of 5 different class periods, as long as the student has a good understanding of what he needs to do to answer yes. Then at the end he writes how many yeses he's recorded and compares this to his predetermined goal. So if you're doing 5 times during the same class period, was I paying attention to my assigned work? Yes or no? Was I following the classroom rules? Yes or no? And if his goal was 5 yeses, 5 out of 10 yeses, and he has gotten 6, then he has exceeded his goal. So this is a pretty simple example, but an effective one. This one is a bit more complicated, but it allows for graphing and visual analysis directly on the student's data sheet. And again, it's really, really important that the student be clear on what level of behavior qualifies for each score, never, sometimes, or always, and then fills in where he falls for each day of the week. So in this example, the goal is for the student to complete class assignments or projects independently as defined by needing no more than one prompt to complete the assignment. Did he do that always, sometimes, or never? Those are things that need to be very clearly defined. How many assignments or projects does he need to complete independently to give himself a rating of always, or the highest number of 9? That's something that you and he need to decide, and he needs to know very clearly how many does he need to complete independently to give himself a 5, or sometimes. How about seldom or never? There's seldom or never has 1, 2, 3. What are the different levels within seldom or never that he needs to score one of those? So this one is pretty complicated and is really best for someone who is at a very high level of awareness, and even someone who is kind of a perfectionist. This kind of thing might work really well for. But that differentiation between the different levels is really critical. And these are things that the student might complete at the end of the day, at the end of each school day they're responding to this. It might be at the end of the same class period each day of the week they respond to this, or they rate themselves. Really, you can tailor the timing to the student's needs. And this final example of self-evaluation is as a weekly form, and the student would evaluate him or herself each day. Again, rating each day from a scale of 1 to 3, or never, always, sometimes. So the student, again, needs to have a really clear understanding of what rate of behavior constitutes each rating. Then at the end of the week, they would calculate the total for each goal or each behavior and see how that score compares to predetermined criteria. So pretty similar. Just keep in mind that the criteria needs to be very well understood, and how the student is rating themselves needs to be very clearly understood for this kind of thing to be successful. Another point I would like to mention is that this type of system might not be a good option for a student who has a very intense fear of failing. If they see themselves consistently not meeting criteria or failing to achieve a goal, then this kind of system, that it's very obvious that they're not meeting the goal, or they're not meeting their goal, it may cause more anxiety and maybe more stressful than it is helpful. So for a student like that, using just antecedent cues or a regular self-monitoring strategy may be more effective. And the final type of self-management that we're going to talk about is self-reinforcement, where the student accesses their own rewards or consequences. Reinforcement might be part of the visual instruction, like in this example, where it's a token board that I'm sure many of you use every day. And there's a picture or something indicating what they get as reinforcement. So once they get 5 stars, they can get the iPad. Once they complete this many math problems, they get reinforcement. This kind of thing teaches the student to be independent for a period of time. And this may need lots and lots and lots of instruction. I know that a lot of the students who I work with, if they if they were in charge of giving themselves reinforcement, they wouldn't wait until they got the 5 stars. They would just go and get the iPad when they had the opportunity. So when I say that these kinds of systems need to be taught, that the student needs to be taught how to use them correctly and for them to be effective, this is a really great example of that. That if we are not teaching the student to use this effectively, they're not going to use it effectively. Because why should they? So we instead need to use prompting and reinforcement to teach them how and when to get their own reinforcement. And we'll talk a little bit more about the steps to teach something like this in a little bit later in the presentation. Now this is my computer graphics representation of a leisure or free time activity book. Each page has a leisure activity that the student is able to do independently. So the student just goes page by page through the book and does what is instructed on those pages. This one was for a family where the parent said, I just want time to take a shower. So this book provided something for the child to do for those 10 minutes while she was showering. The child would get himself reinforcement, which maintained his engagement and his interest, and every few pages would indicate that it was time for him to get this reinforcement. So here the first page says, put together a puzzle. The student does that activity and turns the page. And the next page says, eat 1 M&M. So the student goes to a bowl of M&Ms and eats 1. Now you may be saying, there is no way that my kid would eat just 1 M&M. And you're probably right. Most kids wouldn't eat just 1 M&M. If there's a bowl full of them sitting right in front of them, I probably wouldn't eat just 1 M&M. So, or they wouldn't wait until the book tells them to eat them. They would just be standing at the bowl eating M&Ms after M&M. So remember, something like this takes lots and lots and lots of teaching. A student won't start out eating just 1 M&M. It takes a lot of time. And how do you teach it? Just like you teach any other behavior or skill, with lots of prompting and lots of reinforcement. So I've said this several times already, that a student won't just start using a self-management system and change their behavior. Using this system has to be taught. So often I see a teacher or a special ed aide introduce something like this, and they just hand it to the student, tell them to record their behavior, and then shortly afterward decide that it's not helping. But it's not helping because we haven't taught the student to use it. So we'll talk a little bit more in depth about each of these steps later, but basically you need to first teach the student to discriminate between correct and incorrect responding. If they don't know that the behavior is happening or don't know what behavior you want from them, there's no way that they can accurately record their behavior. Once the student shows accurate discrimination of the targeted behavior, you can teach the student how to use whatever system it is that you've set up. So this means you're teaching them how and when they should be recording. Often you'll need to prompt them to observe and record their behavior first. Simply explaining it to them, explaining whenever you do this, put a check mark here, is not enough. It requires modeling, it requires prompting, it requires reinforcement. And finally, reinforce accurate recording. Rather than focusing on changes in behavior, reinforce the student for recording their behavior accurately, especially at the start. Does the child's score match your score of their behavior? If so, reinforce it. You can gradually shift to reinforcement of the behavior change once mastery of accurate recording is demonstrated. But remember that simply increasing awareness of the behavior often results in behavior change. So you may notice an improvement in behavior without even needing to incorporate or claim for much reinforcement. Really depends on the student. So we've talked about the types of self-management systems. Let's talk about when self-management is appropriate. So how do you know if self-management system might be a good intervention? Here are 4 questions to ask about the student's behavior. And if you can answer yes to all 4 questions, a self-management strategy might be a good option. First, can the student perform the expected behavior? Is the behavior already in the student's repertoire? Based on where he is now, is it realistic to expect him to be able to do what you're asking? If so, then self-management may be a good option. Can the student control the challenging behavior? If so, he might be ready to take responsibility for either that reducing that challenging behavior or for increasing replacement behavior. If not, we need to create an intervention plan for this challenging behavior first. Otherwise, that challenging behavior is going to get in the way of him succeeding with the behavior that we're asking for. Third, does the behavior occur frequently? Is it something that the student notices happening enough that he can observe and record his progress? If it's a behavior that happens maybe once a week or not very frequently, it's going to be really hard to maintain awareness of that behavior and see a difference as we're tracking the behavior. And finally, can the behavior be easily observed and recorded? Is it a behavior that others can see? Does it have a discrete start and end? Can the child easily identify when it's happening or not? If it can be easily observed and recorded, that's perfect. That's the kind of behavior we want for self-management. A self-management strategy, as is the case for most interventions, is going to be most successful in an environment that is predictable and consistent. In a chaotic environment, it's a lot more difficult to notice our own behavior, to control our own behavior, and even know what behavior is expected of us. If everyone's doing something different, if everything is very chaotic, we may not even know what is the correct behavior right now. Plus, this type of environment for a lot of kids makes taking in and analyzing information even harder. So remembering your behavior over a period of time might not be possible. All of this makes the whole process of self-observing and recording a lot harder and less accurate. But in environments like this, another skill that we can consider teaching our students is to identify that this is a chaotic environment and identifying when this is affecting their performance and change it. Another pivotal skill is teaching kids to learn when and how they best can advocate for the conditions that help them succeed. Teach the student to ask to go to the hall or to the learning lab during independent work time. Maybe the student can have the option of bringing an iPod with music to help them concentrate in a loud room. The student doesn't have to be a victim of their environment. They can find ways to control it. So now we know when self-management is appropriate. So let's talk about the steps to teach self-management. Number 1 is we start by defining the behavior. And I'll say this again. Using a self-management intervention needs to be taught. We can't just hand a student a data sheet and expect for behavior to change, or even for the student to use the data sheet correctly. So we start by defining the behavior. This happens before you even talk to the student about using a self-management intervention. You first need to come up with a clear and operational definition of the behavior you're targeting. This should be an objective, an observable, and specific description of the behavior that would allow anyone to read the definition and identify whether or not they see the behavior. So you and the student need to be on the same page about what this behavior looks like and whether or not it's happening. This should also include the topography, meaning what the behavior looks like, how long it lasts, and the level of intensity, if that applies, of correct and incorrect responses. So, for example, if your definition says that a meltdown includes the student banging her head on the wall, then it's not considered a meltdown if she's not banging her head on the wall. It needs to be that specific that anyone who is observing the student can say, yes, that's a meltdown, or no, it's not, including the student themselves. The definition should also describe how to measure the behavior. Is it a frequency or count of how many times a behavior happens? Are we going to do time sampling, and every so many minutes or seconds we record whether or not the behavior is happening? Do we time how long the behavior lasts? What dimension of the behavior are we using for measurement? So once you've got a clear definition of what is and is not the behavior, start collecting baseline data. This is still before you even introduce any of this to the student. We need to get an idea of how the student is performing before the intervention so that we can tell whether or not the intervention is helpful. And remember that simply bringing up more awareness to the behavior changes the behavior. So we don't want to be having the student monitor or even know that they're going to be monitoring this behavior yet. We want a clear baseline before any intervention or any additional awareness is brought to the behavior. So whatever measurement method you're using to monitor the behavior you've chosen, start taking data for comparison once you've started the intervention, so you can look back and compare the two. Next, we're going to choose how you're going to record or the student is going to record and how they're going to know to record. How is this intervention going to work? We first need to choose the type of self-management system that's most appropriate for your student and the behavior, and how are they going to use it. Will they have antecedent cues? Will they be recording on that same visual cue for self-monitoring? Will it be a separate data sheet? Next, determine when the student will be recording and monitoring. Is it limited to just one class period? Is it at any free time during the day? Is it the first 5 minutes of a class period? Unstructured times like lunch and recess, whenever a bell rings? Whatever is most appropriate for your student and their behavior, whenever it's happening the most, is when you want to make sure they're going to be recording. And finally, decide how the student will know that it's time to monitor and record. Thank you. What will be his or her prompt to say, oh, I need to record my behavior now? The start and ends of class periods are usually pretty easy built-in cues. When they hear a bell ring, they record before leaving for their next class. However, for a lot of students and a lot of behaviors, they need to be recording much more frequently than that, multiple times during the same class period. Not to mention at home, or even in elementary schools, there often aren't bells that are ringing all day at consistent intervals. So instead, you can use things like keywords. Every time a teacher says a certain word, that's a cue to the student that he or she should record their behavior. Maybe a student gives some sort of signal, like a thumbs up or pats the student on the back. And this could be at certain points in the class. At the end of each thing, at the end of each of these things, it's time to record. At the end of every 5 math problems, I need to record my behavior. at the end of circle time, story, and alphabet, I need to record my behavior. I've seen some teachers use red and green dots, like the one shown here, to indicate that it's time to record or not. This kind of visual could also be a good way to non-verbally prompt a student who's doing an unwanted behavior. Put an object on the red dot or point to the red dot to say, stop doing that, and on the green dot when they're doing the correct thing. And one of my favorites is to use a timer. You may have heard of tools like the motivator or the invisible clock, and you can set these to beep or vibrate so a student can get an alert without it disrupting the whole class. You can set it to go off at whatever interval you'd like and to repeat. Finally, now that you've got all of these things figured out and know how the system is going to work and how to implement it and exactly what behavior we're looking for and have some baseline data on it, you can introduce it to the student. Again, we can't expect the student to just be able to use the system accurately and consistently right off the bat. Just like any other new behavior, it has to be taught, and this can take time and practice. So let's talk about these steps again. First, we teach the student to discriminate their behavior. This is why it's so important in step 1 to come up with a clear and thorough and specific definition of the behavior. The student, not just you, needs to be able to identify when his behavior matches the behavior that you have defined, the behavior that you are looking for, and what you would say is, yes, this is the behavior, or no, it's not. Then teach the student to observe and record. Teach them to use all of those procedures you've just established, including how to use their data sheets or their other tools, when to observe and record themselves, what prompt to look and listen for, all of those things that you have put in place for the system to work. Now you teach them how to use it, and you reinforce, model, prompt them to do it just like you would any other behavior. And finally, use reinforcement. This might be self-reinforcement, where the student learns to access his own reinforcement as they earn it. At first, it's a good idea to reinforce accuracy rather than behavior change. So, and then also periodically throughout, as you're using a self-monitoring system, look back or, excuse me, go back to reinforcing for accuracy to make sure that accuracy is not changing. Or you can reinforce for achieving a preset criteria when you're reinforcing the behavior change. And you might initially be recording or reinforcing for accurate recording, and then as you see mastery of accurate recording, transition to reinforcing for behavior change. And the last step is monitoring progress and fading the intervention. So you will be continually checking progress, graphing data, making sure that using the self-management intervention is actually resulting in the desired behavior change. If it is, great. You should see progress pretty quickly, and it should be significant progress. If you're not seeing quick or significant progress, you may be targeting the wrong dimension of behavior. So maybe you're having the student record how many times it's happening, but really a time sampling tracking would better serve the student, and if it's happening very frequently, that might help them to record more accurately. Just an example. Or you might be using a self-management system that is just too complex for the student to be able to use right now. So consider changing some aspect of the system, or go back to teaching the student correct discrimination of their own behavior and of observing and recording it accurately, and then reintroduce it and see if you see behavior change more quickly and more significantly. Once your student has met his or her goal for the intervention, meaning they have reached the level of the level of behavior that you have set as their mastery, keep the intervention in place for a few days to ensure that they have mastered it. Then you can gradually fade the intervention. We'll talk about a couple examples of fading shortly, but as you fade back, continue to take data and monitor the progress. At each level of fading, stay there until the student again shows that they have reached and are staying at their goal level of performance. You might find that any improvement that's been made decreases once you start to fade. If so, stay there for a few days at the level that you have faded to and see if it improves again at this new level of the intervention. If not, you might have faded too quickly and you need to put the intervention back in place at that higher level. You might also find that at certain times of day or under certain circumstances, the behavior is better or worse than at other times. In that case, again, put the intervention back in place at a higher level during those most difficult times. It's so important that we continue monitoring progress as we're fading out an intervention if we don't want to have to start back over to square one. So fading involves decreasing the frequency, duration, or intensity of an intervention, and there are lots of ways that you can fade an intervention. For a strict antecedent cue intervention, you might make the graphic smaller or gradually move the visual cue farther away from the area where it's used. Note that sometimes an intervention can't be faded completely. The student might be cognitively unable to perform a behavior at the level you want without the help of some cue or intervention. Someone with executive functioning challenges might not be able to hold some information or a long sequence of steps in mind. So an external cue might always be needed, and that's okay. When you're self-observing and recording, you might decrease the number of recordings in one class period or how many times throughout the day the student is recording. You might start with recording at the end of each class period and gradually decrease to only recording once per day, for example. In this example, we're requiring fewer observations or recordings for one period of time. So as we decrease the number, we also extend the intervals between recordings. So we start with 10 recordings at maybe 4-minute intervals. Now we're down to 8 recordings at 5-minute intervals, and 5 recordings at 8-minute intervals, until we just gradually work down to just only 1 recording at the end of the class period. And I just cut the data sheet to reflect how many recordings I wanted. And I'm going to go through this one pretty quickly because we're about out of time. This example shows a decrease in the number of recordings during one class period and throughout, down to using the same data sheet for the entire week. So we start with 5 recordings during the class period, slowly decrease to just 1 recording for the class period. And at this point, we can go back to the original data sheet with 5 opportunities, but now we use it for the whole week. We record once on each day that we have the class. So the total number of yeses at the end of the week is similar to the number for that class period when we were recording multiple times in the same period. If so, it's a good indication that the behavior change procedure was successful and that we have faded it successfully. Okay, thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. Please follow the Johnson Center on our YouTube channel. We also have, we're also on Facebook and Twitter. You can sign up for our email notifications. And for more information about this webinar or any of our services, please feel free to contact us by email or phone. You will receive an email about the certificate of attendance. You can also just go to this link, tinyurl.com/testonwebinar, and that will give you a couple of just a couple of questions that you have to answer in order to receive your certificate of attendance. Thank you again for being here. My name is Amanda Tami, and it has been my pleasure to present this information to you. I hope that you find some of it helpful, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.